Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael S. Sieber. You're listening to Equal Chance to be Unequal, my podcast about unlocking human potential through helping people disconnected from their purpose uncover and live their purpose.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Equal Chance to be Unequal. In today's episode of our podcast, I'm going to share a few thoughts on 5 things I think you can do, or habits I think you can use to revolutionize whatever happens for you in 2018. Now, I'm a big fan of an old saying that I heard quite some time ago. It's called "Every day is New Year's Day." So when I'm working with clients and individuals, I don't necessarily subscribe to doing things on the typical Western calendar year. But if you do, and it's your perspective to want to function that way or work on your goals within the calendar year 2018, I'm going to take a little bit of time today to work through 5 habits or 5 things that I think will really be valuable for you to transform your life in some capacity. So in today's conversation, I want to do just a really quick opening reflection, talk about a few things that I'm seeing changing in society, some articles that I've read recently that I think will be really value add to you, and then work through the 5 habits or the 5 things that I'm really looking for in a client to make sure that he or she is making the appropriate adjustments in his or her life. And then look a little bit at some of the things towards the end of our podcast, of things that could basically take you from awareness to action. So the opening reflection for me is a couple of questions, and you're welcome to pause the podcast and think about each of these in your own time. But I want you to think about your full-time job or your part-time job or whatever corporate or organization or not-for-profit work that you do. Likely the organization that you work with has some sort of strategic objective, or it has some sort of a goal, or it has something that you need to accomplish in the calendar year or in the fiscal year in which you're being assessed. So the first question in our opening reflection is, how do you set and quality check progress in your corporate, organizational, or professional goals? Now, take a few seconds if you like to be able to kind of think about that. There's likely a long process for you or your organization. In some organizations, maybe there is enough capital to be able to support a strategy team, and that strategy team is what actually sets the corporate goals, and then the senior executive team simply approves them. Potentially, your organization facilitates an offsite retreat, and you set your strategic objectives for the next year then. Perhaps your organization doesn't set them and just kind of works holacratically through the year in whatever way it sees fit. Potentially, your corporate goals are set via your board. If you're a not-for-profit or some sort of a B Corp or some sort of an organization that places a lot of value on having a board, maybe they do most of the setting for you. Sometimes people will use the SMART methodology in creating these goals, that the goal is specific, measurable, action-oriented, relevant, or time-based. I'm a big fan of something that came from Chris McChesney and the Franklin Covey group a number of years ago called the 4 Disciplines of Execution. And that's the kind of goal-setting methodology that I prefer to use when I'm working for myself on my own goals or with clients. Another thing to take into consideration when you're thinking about setting and or quality checking progress on corporate goals are shareholder expectations, right? Because oftentimes bigger organizations, they do have to take into consideration what the shareholders want. So when you think about on a weekly, potentially monthly or quarterly or annual basis, what are the things that your organization does to quality check progress? In some cases, maybe the strategy team is the one that collects the data monthly. Perhaps each of your respective departments in the organization, maybe you lead one of those departments. You discuss progress and trends towards those annual goals in a weekly meeting with your team. Maybe that somehow filters down into individual performance reviews, and whether it's a weekly, monthly, quarterly, or annual basis, you receive some sort of feedback or recognition or some sort of reward, something back to appraise your performance. When I think about the quality checking of progress in this context, I think about many organizations struggle to keep open lines of communication, so I'm hopeful that your organization does a good job, or you do a great job with your respective team members about keeping open lines of communication through this process. I'm a big fan, and I'll talk about this in a bit, pure accountability. Hopefully that there's some of that within your organization. Mentioned a second ago, reward and recognition systems, especially for millennials, those people born between 1980 and the year 2000. More so than previous generations, they have higher levels of anxiety and nervousness, and they do require a little bit more weekly feedback, some sort of positive recognition or reward to know that they're moving in the appropriate direction. So as you think about that, maybe you use some version of what I was just describing to set and quality check your progress on corporate goals. So then the second question is, when you think about 2018, do you follow that same process for your personal goals? Now, you can answer yes or no, or there's some middle ground there, but I want you to ask yourself really deeply, but why? Why do you use the specific process that you utilize? And after you set your personal goals, if you do, what is your process for setting them? Does it look the same as what you do inside your corporate position and organization, or is it something completely separate? When you think about setting those, do you tell specific people around you about your goals? Who are they? Do they hold you accountable to them? How often do you check in with them, or how often do those individuals check in with you to make sure that you're continually making progress in those goals? If you do not meet some sort of a short-term objective, are there specific consequences that you endure for not moving forward appropriately? If you do meet your milestones and goals, whether monthly or quarterly or annually, do you find yourself rewarding yourself for the various things that you've accomplished? So I just want you to take stock a little bit and say there's probably a pretty defined process that you utilize inside your organization or your work to basically set quality check progress on a goal. And I'm just a big fan of business strategy concepts somewhat guiding our personal lives, and ask the question about whether or not you place that same process on your personal goals to kind of meld the strategy that exists inside your job with the things that you're attempting to accomplish personally. I just think there's a lot of value there in the small daily habits and rituals that we utilize to make sure that we're advancing our personal lives as well as our professional lives. So I think about this upcoming year, and I've read quite a bit, especially at the end of 2017 and into halfway through January already in 2018. And there are a couple things that I've been reading that kind of struck me about potential adjustments and changes that may be coming at some point for us in 2018. And so I remember reading an article on LinkedIn by a guy named Chip Cutter and a woman, Laura Lorenzetti Soper. The article was titled The 50 Big Ideas for 2018. And there are obviously 50 ideas, but I'm going to pull out 3 that I think are relevant. One of them was that we need to be prepared for the M&A boom, or the mergers and acquisitions boom. So if you think about 2017, there were quite a few deals that were done, from Amazon buying Whole Foods, Intel bought a company called Mobileye, United Technologies spent a bunch of money on another organization called Rockwell Collins. Towards the end of the year, I think Disney bought Fox and many of their media assets. There was also a purchase of CBS buying Aetna. And when you think about 2018, I don't know what is actually coming down the pipe, but I thought that this was an interesting thing to consider, that we more recently have seen that the new tax bill was passed, so there's going to be a fair percentage or a fair amount of corporate tax cuts. The economy is relatively consistent for the last quite a few years. And so because we have a booming economy, pair that with corporate tax cuts, there's a lot of incentive for C-suites and boards to be able to do deals and make things happen. And then also there's a fairly unpredictable society, right? If you pay any attention to the mainstream media, there's a lot of divisiveness happening specifically in America. I don't see that as much internationally when I travel or I pay attention to news sources in other countries. But there are certainly crazy things happening in lots of different places. But our society has become a bit more unpredictable. So if you look at 2018, probably going to be some more M&A activity. If you marry the idea of having a corporate tax cut with a booming economy, with an unpredictable society, being able to predict whatever is going to come into the future becomes harder. So the C-suites of many large organizations, in order to get ahead of the curve, are probably going to utilize the cash they have on hand, or the tax cuts, or just confidence in the economy to be able to do things and snatch up other organizations that they think are good value add. The second thing that I read on this particular report was there's an economist, Stephen Kopitz, president of the Princeton Energy Advisors, He thinks that at some point during 2018, there's going to be a 1987 style sell-off within the stock market. And so according to his data, we're in the second longest bull market in U.S. history currently. He does not think that it's going to trigger a major recession for Americans to be concerned about, but he does believe that the Dow Jones will probably drop 20% or more. And so for those of you who have a fair amount of dollars tied up in the stock market, something to be just a little bit aware of, just keep an eye out for. I've seen a big shift and lots of growth in the alternative asset market. I don't know enough about it to make recommendations, and I'm not a financial advisor, but I've been spending more time with people who are in that sphere, and it might be an interesting alternative for you to consider. Is that if the stock market's going to go through those adjustments, it might be nice to have a little bit of your money in alternatives where there's an actual asset that underlies the money that you have invested. The third thing that Cutter and Soper talked about in this LinkedIn article was they believe that the American mall, what has been built since the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way through today, is going to become in many ways the new town square. And we're seeing more and more people spend less time at home eating dinner and probably going out and spending time in restaurants and spending time with friends and other people. So if the American mall becomes the new town square, basically what's happening is that within malls, the kind of 1980s and 1990s model of going to one place to sell gifts really doesn't work anymore. There's no reason to necessarily have a brick and mortar store if you can order from a website like Amazon.com and get your product the next day without having to leave your home. Makes a heck of a lot more sense to utilize the mall differently, where you're not just going there to buy something. You're actually going there to have an experience, not to buy a thing. So if the 1980s model of selling a gift in person doesn't work, maybe malls will be better at embracing grocery stores or a gym, or maybe they'll attach apartments to the mall somehow. You'll see them gravitate towards allowing tenants that sell services that require weekly or monthly visits, so that there are more people coming into that new version of the town square, so that there is more opportunity for people to serendipitously connect and have conversation and have food and have an experience, as opposed to only going there to buy a thing. And I think that's an important thing to consider for 2018, is that as we spend less time in our homes and more time with other people, we really need to be great at emotional intelligence and developing out relationships and doing the best that we can to meet new people and offer up those opportunities for serendipitous growth and luck. Maybe there's something else that you see as being a potential adjustment or change in 2018, and would love to have you share that with me in whatever way you deem fit. So when I think about coaching, and I think about the 5 habits, there are many things that I'm looking for with a client. And of course, I do have a very defined process that I put him or her or them through. And I'm not necessarily going to touch on that today, but I'm going to talk about some of the underlying things that I'm looking to have happen to provide for them the best experience possible from me, but also for them to feel very engaged in multiple areas of their life at the same time. Now, there's the 5 areas or the 5 habits for me. The first one is work and life integration. So work-life balance, the old terminology that we've heard for the last 20, 25 years, I don't believe is valid anymore. But work-life integration is pretty critical to me. So what I'm looking for is, does the person have the capacity to be their most authentic self at home and at work? Or do they feel that they have to wear a mask or some sort of put forth some sort of an image when they're out in the community? And I don't want that to happen. I want them to be the same person at home and to be the same person when they're at work, where they're having the capacity to use their preferred or natural communication styles, their motivators, their core values. Once they define their personal mission, why they do what they do, they get to live that regardless of where they're at. Whatever goals they have set for themselves for that year or for that quarter, they get to spend quality time each day working towards it. If you've ever done the StrengthsFinder assessment, maybe they get to, on a daily basis, use most, or if not all 5 of their top strengths. Each day, they're slowly but surely building their emotional intelligence and having the capacity to be self-aware, to self-manage themselves, to be socially aware, to build relationships, and to be motivated by certain things. But that Work-life integration for me is also they have the capacity to learn on a daily basis, and each of us prefers to learn differently. I love to listen to podcasts. I have a number that automatically come into my phone each day. So for me, when I'm in the car, podcast is the thing. But for me, quite some time ago, books were the thing. Maybe for you, it's watching a YouTube video, or it's going to a specific class, or using a massive open online course to be able to gather specific information. Whatever the case is, underlying one of the major things or one of the major habits for me is that I can figure out a way to help the person with work-life integration, which I'll talk more about in a second. Now, the second area is what I would call pattern recognition through reflection. So just a brief description of this is, do they have the capacity to create a daily, a weekly, or a monthly habit that, if done after the coaching relationship finishes, if they continue it, are they going to continue to develop even without me? And that's a really critical thing, is that I've instilled some sort of confidence or some sort of process in their mind that if they keep doing it, they're going to remain successful and keep moving things forward. So what I'm really looking for here is that, do they have a really, really deep self-awareness of relationships, of their own health, of their own emotional intelligence, of their own motivation, and how do they find those things about themselves? How do they take notes or use specific tools to make sure that happens? And oftentimes I teach something called the Gibbs reflective cycle, which is a 3-step process that looks at how do we approach new scenarios and situations, how do we take action in that scenario, and then how do we reflect on it when we're done, which is a very, very critical piece to me, is that if we take time for reflection, we can learn a heck of a lot more if we're taking time for that learning and then adjusting our behavior the next day or the next month. Now, the third area that I'm looking to affect when I'm coaching is a little bit new for me this year, but I think it's a critical one. And I'm looking at it as saying, how do we, from a health standpoint, support our genetics, our DNA, and our epigenetics, or basically our environment or our gut biome, and how do we eat the appropriate foods, or how do we take care of our body through exercise to make sure that we're being the most unique version of ourselves, because all of us have very, very unique DNA. How do we really appropriately consume the right foods to make sure that our gut flora and biome are helping our body the most it possibly can? Because if it's not well, the probability of it impacting your health negatively through cold, flu, other types of sickness, things like cancer, which has actually run through my family quite a bit, negative impacts on a person's mood, being unhappy or being angry, how do they respond to specific stimuli? So one of the things that I've tried to gather more resources on, or tried to guide folks to, or provide additional time with dietitians or people along those lines, is to make sure that not only are we doing what's best for the person's DNA, but also making sure that their epigenetics are cared for. So if we have to offer up suggestions or resources around changes in diet, changes in a health routine, or even things like mental or emotional spirituality, to figure out a way to find balance in an otherwise crazy world. So one of the things I'm focused on a lot this year is, how do we help an individual with his or her genetics or epigenetics? Now, the fourth area I'm looking for here is personal commitment to a specific goal, whatever that may be. And also, besides me, are they surrounding themselves with some sort of peer accountability? And so what I'm really interested in is looking at and saying, when a person hits rock bottom in some area of their life, how do they develop an internal hardiness to continue to push through whatever that rough time is? Do they have the capacity to bounce back and stay committed to a long-term goal, even though the immediate gratification or the immediate reward doesn't show up? And that's a really tough thing for many people to do, and I've had to employ a variety of tactics to see if we can get people past that. But through peer accountability, or making your goals known publicly, it's a lot simpler for you to be able to accomplish your goals, because by telling a friend or a group of friends that you're trying to accomplish a specific thing, you're going to feel committed to that individual, or not wanting to let him down, or not wanting to feel the shame of having to go back to him or her in saying that you didn't accomplish a specific task. So even after they're done being accountable to me as the paid coach, who in their life is going to serve as the ongoing sense of peer accountability, or accountability group of small people to make sure that they're advancing? Now, the fifth thing is I'm obviously a big fan of developing out mission statements. So as I put people through my trademark process called Incorporate You, one of the things that comes out of it is the writing of a personal mission statement. And so I do use a defined process. I do use a specific assessment and a specific Q&A process to write that mission with the person. And then what we really ideally want is that most of the really difficult life decisions that the person has to make are based on that mission, or they use that as their guiding star. So I'm just a big fan of the quote. You've probably seen it on some of my social media channels. The quote is, "Be the person you needed when you were younger." And then what that means is I'm helping a person understand the challenges that they went through when they were younger, but that it's very incredibly fulfilling today to help others who are going through challenges that you've already overcome at some point in your past. So if we can define that mission, and then I find out months or years later that the person that I've worked with is still living that specific mission and using it to guide his or her behavior, that to me means a ton, because at the end of the day, that's what I really want, is for those persons to be able to live that thing on an ongoing basis, because it's so meaningful and critical to their life that they find a unique way to give back to their respective communities. So let's dive in just a little bit more in depth in a couple of those. I actually gave quite a bit of information there, looking at the 5 things in summary. But with work and life integration, this kind of the first thing is that if we have the capacity to build the habit of, what the first habit for me is the confrontation of fear. And so I use the work and life integration kind of as a tool to help explain that. From the standpoint of, if you've heard the 2 acronyms, one is FOMO, the other is FOGI. FOMO stands for fear of missing out, which is essentially an apprehension or an inner feeling that you have that others might be having a rewarding experience or some sort of fun when you're not there. And so a lot of people that I've seen and interacted with, depending on their personality profiles, especially if they're extrovert and people-oriented, they suffer from FOMO. They think they have to go to all of these events and do all these things and say yes to a bunch of stuff that isn't really value add to their life. So they lose out on work-life integration. They don't have the capacity to stay committed to their own goals in some meaningful way. Now the other, FOGI, fear of joining in, is basically a person who neglects or doesn't take the time to actually opt into specific experiences. So they purposely opt out of an in-person meeting, a lunch, some sort of a networking event, or they don't post content on social media because they fear of whether they're in person not getting hugs or not having people talk to them, or somebody not shaking their hand, or on social media they fear that nobody's going to like their picture or their comment, or they're not going to receive comments on something specifically. So when we're thinking about the confrontation of fears, and these are 2 ways in which it manifests itself in order to kind of get to this place of work-life integration, what I'm finding for my clients is that their major challenges include they're lacking balance in their life, right? They're spending too much time at work, or they're spending too much time at home, but they're not finding balance or happiness in both areas of their life appropriately. They're likely very unhappy or disengaged in some capacity. So as an example, Gallup put out the State of the American Workplace for 2017 not too long ago, just a few months back, and only 33% of the American workforce actually likes their job on average. And so there are a lot of very unhappy people. That means 67 to 70% of people in the American workforce. So that's roughly 67 million to about 70 million people don't like their work and they are unhappy. And so what that ends up causing is they avoid tough conversations. They fear vulnerability. They do a lot inside their corporate roles to cover their own ass. They do a lot more to protect their reputation and the personality ethic associated with that than they do to actually confront their own fears, to move forward on a way that's going to give them the work-life integration that they actually deserve. So I've got a client, his name is Tim, VP of Finance for a Phoenix-based organization. Just super quick example. His boss is not overly kind or polite, relatively disengaged. Tim's wife is struggling a little bit, relatively insecure in her own role, but she doesn't work. She just has 2 kids that are growing, but soon to be leaving the house. Both of those children are a bit entitled because Tim makes a fair amount of money. And so what I think Tim has been struggling with is that he's over devoted a bit of his time to work, because when he goes home, the balance just isn't there because the things that he truly desires out of life aren't necessarily happening at home. So to help him continue to move forward and to advance his own business, a couple of goals that he had were about launching his own business, which I've helped him do. And then he also desired to sit on a prominent local not-for-profit board, which he was able to join not too long ago. And both of those things together are creating an opportunity for Tim to spend less time at work and to spend more time at home, because his wife is actually engaged in helping him launch the business and does desire to learn more about the not-for-profit board and going to events and participating in things. So we're finding new channels by which Tim can confront his own fears and find new ways that maybe he hadn't thought of before to integrate the work and life pieces for him. So again, the action here is the confrontation of fear. Sometimes that means we have to have the really difficult conversation. Sometimes that means we have to change a daily routine. Sometimes that means we have to be a little bit vulnerable and share personal stories. Sometimes that means we have to learn via courses or books or podcasts or mentorship, or serving on a board or volunteerism through a local not-for-profit. Or sometimes that means that even when we're overly negative, we have to give another person the benefit of the doubt and just assume positive intent, which I'm hopeful that Tim's wife offers to him. So when we think about one of the things I'm really looking at, which is work and life integration, oftentimes the way that we get to that is to confront our fears and find new paths or new methods by which we're going to bring those two things somewhat dichotomously back together. And for Tim, it was more conversations with his wife, and that just happened to move through the launch of his own business or serving on the not-for-profit board or doing something with his children as they age to the point of moving out of the house. Now, the second thing, the pattern recognition through reflection, I like this one a little bit from the standpoint of what's the habit here. And a really, really significant habit for us to consider is what I would refer to as time distribution. So when we think about pattern recognition, you might have heard this term. It became popular back in 2012. The term is called auto-analytics. And basically what it is it's automated self-tracking and analysis of your body or of your life in some capacity through technology. Now, many of you who are interested in health, you probably have used Fitbit or an Apple Watch or a Garmin watch or something that helps you to understand analytics about your body, your sleep patterns, or oxygen or number of steps that you take in a specific day. There are tools that, as an example, help you to understand auto-analytics. Now, I go to a gym pretty regularly. They have a machine called an in-body machine, and it allows me to step on basically a scale, and it runs electrical current through my body, and it tells me in each of my limbs and the trunk, basically my chest and abdomen, what is the water retention in each of those areas, and it tells me muscle mass, and it tells me fat composition. And so every 60 days, I step onto the in-body machine to be able to sense how much muscle am I building in those respective areas, or how much fat am I burning as a result of changes to my diet or time going to the gym. And so having those auto-analytics is very important, but I need that to be able to recognize the patterns that are happening in my life, and I need to see through monthly reflection what are the changes that are being made. So auto-analytics could be something that helps you in a meaningful way if you're willing to manage your time and distribute a little bit differently to be able to reflect on and take care of those things. So as an example, without appropriate time distribution, what we have to be concerned with is a person's lack of clarity, right? Introverts oftentimes will not take enough action on specific things. They'll tend to just go back to their home or to a quiet place and do things that don't really advance their lives necessarily. Whereas extroverts do the opposite. They tend to take an awful lot of action on things that don't really truly add value to the world. So my work as a coach is oftentimes to bring those two things to the center, to try to bring clarity by cutting for extroverts out specific action that doesn't add value, or for introverts, asking them to take a little bit more action on things that are in alignment with their mission. So the auto-analytics and taking a little bit more time for reflection helps to remove any ambiguity. It helps to not second guess ourselves. It helps to define some sort of a path forward. It helps us avoid seeking consensus from other people. It helps us to avoid having to go talk to others to get validation from them when their opinion or context isn't necessarily relevant. So I have a friend, her name is Marie. Marie lived in a couple different states, but did have a relatively abusive ex-husband. And as a result of the disease that kind of came from that relationship and the various things that happened for her with the ex-husband, with her family, or with her professionally, she ended up kind of going through a period of time where she had really significant and recurring health issues. And as she and I had begun to work together a number of years ago, and we've stayed friends since, I've seen her kind of work through those things by talking to a therapist or checking in with me every now and again, or by changing specific things about her diet or things that she does from an exercise standpoint. But she wouldn't have known to adjust those things had she not taken the time for reflection and identifying the patterns and being able to adjust her behavior accordingly. And so now, after moving around quite a bit, she has settled into the Phoenix area. She has become an entrepreneur, even though she does have a full-time job. And she has begun to move forward in a very confident way. And it's been great for me as a friend to watch her build out her confidence and watch her build a brand in the community in ways that she hadn't before. And I think it was because she took the time for auto analytics and she took the time for identifying those patterns. And another resource here, I think that's relevant whether Marie used it or not, is something called the 5-Minute Journal. A great friend of mine had given me a copy a couple years back, and I've actually bought multiple copies for clients that I have just because it's such an interesting tool. So whether you get the paper version or you get the app that you can download on your phone, the 5-Minute Journal is a great positive psychology tool to help you reflect and look at auto analytics in some capacity. 360-degree feedback can help if that happens for you professionally, or you use something out of Harvard back from 2006. It's called the Reflected Best Self exercise. Another great tool to be able to collect analytics about yourself, whether you set annual goals or whether you do things on a weekly or monthly basis to celebrate wins. We got to find something that can help you distribute your time a little bit differently so that you're feeling better, right? So maybe it's Fitbit, maybe it's InBody, maybe it's stepping on the scale weekly, maybe it's using QuickBooks Online to track your bank balance. Maybe you use auto analytics from a social media standpoint. You know, your car from Google Maps or whatever kind of car you have, it's tracking you so it can see where you're going. Whether you share your personal or professional goals, tracking your dreams if you're a little bit more intuitive. There are so many things that you can do to collect data and collect that auto analytics, but are you making the time on a weekly or monthly basis to look back at those patterns and reflect on what do they mean, and then take time the following month or quarter to be able to adjust your behavior accordingly? So another big thing for me is habit number 2, which is basically time distribution. And the number one way for me to be able to redistribute a person's time is to look for those patterns in that person's life. So the third thing here, the genetics and epigenetics, kind of the habit for me that I really want to focus on for the person is their capacity for physical, mental, or spiritual health. And, it's your choice to believe whatever the things that you desire to believe about your body or about specific, religious beliefs or faith-based beliefs, completely up to you. I was on a website, ethnology.com, not too long ago, and they have some data that shows that there are on planet Earth 7,000 recognized religions. And so it's very easy for humans to get caught up in believing that their one belief structure is the only way. But of the 7.7 billion people on the planet, there are more than 7,000 belief structures. And so I just want to encourage everybody to be very, very respectful of a person. Just because he or she believes something different doesn't mean that they're incorrect. It's just their interpretation of the world. So with genetics and epigenetics and health, which has become a big thing for me, but also for the folks I serve, Viome.com, Viome.com, a very, very interesting organization. I've been listening to a number of podcasts, like Bulletproof Radio by a guy named Dave Asprey, and Tim Ferriss has a great podcast as well. And through those podcasts, I've learned about Viome, and some of the things that they talk about are really, really super interesting. So through their data, they have found that humans have more than 40 trillion microorganisms in our gut, in our microbiome. And so their belief structure and some of the new science and some of the research that they're doing is finding that the microbiome actually has a greater impact on your health than whatever your DNA sequence is. And so this is something to be really, really aware of as the medicine around it develops, because the traditional Western model of medicine, which is kind of this one-size-fits-all thing, obviously is clearly being disrupted over the last probably 10 years and will continue to in the next probably 20 to 30 as we have more one-on-one based medicine, because it's the one-size-fits-all model just doesn't work for everybody. And we're seeing too many additional bouts with cancer and death that don't have to happen because of adjustments in diet or because of adjustments in thought processes, or if we more specifically tailor the medicine to the person's DNA or to the microbiome, we have a better chance of treating them. So what Viome suggests is that the microbiome actually has a greater impact on health and performance and longevity purely than your DNA. And so what I love about them is their tagline says, stop fighting 21st century chronic diseases with 20th century tools. And it's a great way to kind of metaphorically say, the old way isn't working. Let's try something different and new to make you the healthiest person you could possibly be. So when I think about this, I have a client, Peggy, on the East Coast. Peggy, very, very driven gal, very successful in her career, makes a lot of money. But because she was so driven to accomplish, she ended up stressing out her body quite a bit and was diagnosed with cancer in her early 20s. And so through time, continued to depress her body, ended up having further reproductive issues with her body, stress, things happened in her personal relationships. She ended up getting divorced, continued to push herself very hard because of the professional success that she was looking for. And so finally got to the point where she had to basically take a forced sabbatical, where more recently, because of advances in technology, she was able to be diagnosed with a disease. And she has had to completely adjust her lifestyle. And her boss and her colleagues at work have given her a lot of freedom and flexibility around that, because there's something very, very true now with the advancements in genetics and epigenetics to see what she was actually experiencing in the last 20, 30 years that science just was not aware of. So when I think about this and I think about Peggy's capacity now to live a very, very good life, and to properly serve the 40 trillion microorganisms that are in her stomach, she now has the much better ability to do that because of organizations like Viome and others that are helping us to see what foods are healthy and which ones aren't. So I'm a big fan that if you're thinking about weight management, or you're thinking about increasing your energy, or finding better mental focus, or adjusting your sleep patterns, or you're looking for more clear skin, maybe you want to live longer, right? Dave Asprey from Bulletproof Radio thinks that he's going to live to be 170, which to me is perfectly logical, right? He does all the right things with his body. That to me seems entirely possible. If you desire to have lower stress, or you just don't want to get sick, there's so many things I think that you can do to kind of start in that direction. Maybe it's meditation or some sort of faith-based prayer. Maybe it's yoga. Maybe it's exercise. Maybe it's a look at your specific genetic markers and what are you doing to adjust them. Maybe you time activities in your day differently, maybe waking up early or waking up later. Maybe it's looking at what I did at the end of last year, which was 23andMe. 23andMe is an ancestry service, but what they do is they basically determine your ancestry by figuring out your DNA sequence. So once 23andMe had the report of what my DNA sequence is, I then downloaded that from the 23andMe page, and I gave it to a separate organization called the Boulder Longevity Institute, and their staff was able to look at my DNA sequence and tell me very specifically about my body and some of the things that I was struggling with, or some of the markers that I might have or might trigger later, specific to dementia, Alzheimer's, celiac disease. And those things were very powerful for me to know, because now there are very specific foods, specific types of sugar, specific types of fats, specific meats. There are many things that I've cut out of my diet on purpose to make sure that I'm not triggering these specific genetic markers to turn on, and to also make sure that the microorganisms in my biome are working very well. So if we're doing great with our health, whether it's mental, spiritual, emotional, maybe there's something here that could be value add for you, but I think that there's a lot of value in changing that if you desire to become a higher and better version of yourself, whether it's physical or mental health or spiritual health. That is going to be a very, very clear path to you being able to accomplish whatever you desire next. So the fourth thing here, the habit for me is accountability or accountability partners. I'm going to talk a little bit about Robert Cialdini in his book from the mid-'80s called Influence. And one of the laws is called the law of commitment or the law of consistency. And what humans do is we have a very, very deep need to be seen as rational, consistent, and committed beings. Now, we have this need to be seen that way, but we are not that way. If you are interested, look at Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Dan Ariely out of Duke wrote a book called Predictably Irrational. And so there's lots of great research to show how irrational human beings are, regardless of age. But for some reason, we have this deep need to be seen as rational, consistent, and committed. So what Cialdini's work found, and still supported today, is that if we make some sort of a commitment to something, we tend to follow through on that commitment because we don't want to be seen as irrational. And so it's really important to think about that. So what I'm a big fan of doing with clients is that if I can get small actions or small commitments from them in support of some larger goal that I'm attempting to move them to, that's fantastic, right? Because I've got a little bit of buy-in from them to be able to move them. But then the second thing is that I'm looking for them to have some sort of or make some sort of a public comment or commitment towards that same goal. So I've just elevated them to the next level, right? They committed to it in small action. Now, number two is they've said it to another group of individuals publicly. And then now they continue to move down that path. And then now, based on whatever their language of appreciation is, step three for me is to always reward them for whatever it is that they're doing. And so everybody receives appreciation and rewards differently. I just make sure that I go over the top with rewards to make sure that they're feeling supported and moving in the appropriate direction. So it's a very, very key thing. So what I'm seeing from other clients is that if we don't have the peers to hold us accountable, or we don't have a coach to hold us accountable, we often get into a place of mediocrity, or we have eroding performance, or we're not comfortable in something. We're not disciplined to be able to accomplish specific things daily or weekly. We lack appreciation. We're not having that peer pressure that's required. Or in some cases, professionally, the boss becomes the sole source of discipline, and the person doesn't have the capacity to discipline him or herself. So really important that we figure out ways to overcome those and develop new habits. And one of the ways to do that, whether it's a coach or it's some sort of peer accountability, is to create a new level of consistent and commitment. So worked with a guy back in late 2016, early 2017. His name is Doug, real estate developer in the Midwest. Incredible success for him financially, and his family did very, very well. Made a lot of really, really good moves. But then, as with most people, once you get in your late 40s and right around 50, we tend to go through the midlife crisis, right? And in many cases for people, that means they're trying to find a different spouse, or they're trying to spend money on things that they think will add value, trips around the world, right? Whatever it is, they figure out ways to try to discover themselves through taking action, and that's more than okay. So Doug maybe just got a little bit disconnected from his life's purpose. Loved to be able to party because he knew a lot of wealthy folks and celebrity types. But what he did that was really, really brilliant was he started to pull back the reins a little bit from a financial standpoint on his family. And the way that he referred to it was as he created necessity in their life, and he created a way for them to find ways to learn through their own, to learn on their own, and to learn through their own mistakes, as opposed to him being able to fund whatever it is that they were going to do. And so what I really appreciate about Doug is that he took that same perspective in terms of how he was applying it to his friends or his kids or his employees about creating necessity, and he purposely applied it to himself, even though he didn't need to. And so what he did, separate from real estate development, was he started a health-based peer accountability group. And so this is a little bit outside of the scope of what he and I were doing together, but I loved it because it put him into a leadership position over people that are not in his industry, and he got to meet a ton of people and make new contacts and find ways to help other people remain consistent. And that in a way, this health-based peer accountability group gave him additional skill sets that are going to help him as his business expands out of the Midwest and into other parts of the country. So I'm just a really big fan when it comes to peer accountability and that fourth habit of making sure that when we set goals, we set them transparently. We do have some sort of an accountability group around us. Sometimes people refer to that as a personal board of directors. I've heard it called other things, but whether it's an accountability group, personal board of directors is your call. But what it really comes down to, for me, day after day after day, is what I've seen is that really smart people, very wealthy people, very successful people, very good people oftentimes don't reach their goals unless they have the right daily habit and ritual in place that allows for them to work on that goal on a day-to-day basis. So if there's some sort of an individual and or team reward, and there's some sort of an appreciation structure built in that offers a lot of success in that, that's fantastic. But if we want to really work on this particular habit, we have to make sure that we set transparent goals, we allow other people to hold us accountable, and we take daily action in the achievement of those goals. So the fifth habit, the review your why, which we talked about just a little bit back, this to me is a very interesting thing. I talked earlier about Gallup in their State of the American Workplace report. There's a lot of really interesting data in it. I encourage you to look at it. I already mentioned that 33% of the average Americans engaged are happy by their job. That means that roughly 52% are what's referred to as disengaged, meaning they just go into work to collect a paycheck. But there are still 16 or 17% that are what's called actively disengaged. And they're the people who really dislike their work, and they're trying to make work basically a living hell for other people around them. And so they're very disconnected from their own purpose. And so my job oftentimes is, when I'm asking a person to understand his or her mission or their personal why, is that I want to connect the person's personal mission to the employer or the organization's mission. So if there's alignment between those two things, it's a lot easier for a person to understand and review his or her why on a day-to-day basis, and or live it through the organizations that they serve, whether it's a full-time job that pays them, or whether it's serving on a not-for-profit board, or whether it's some other type of thing that they do extracurricularly in the community. It's really important that there's alignment between personal mission and the mission of the organization they're serving. So the challenges that I'm seeing here oftentimes with clients, or just things that I'm seeing in the community, is that oftentimes people take an awful lot of action without specific meaning. And then what happens later in life is that they have a very undefined legacy. They don't really know what they left the world. And that's oftentimes what I get called for, is we want to understand what is my legacy and how am I going to properly impact society or my community or my family. So I really try to shift people away from what Stephen Covey talked about as being a personality ethic, and shift them back towards what's called a character ethic. So within the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Covey talks about how in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, society was built on a character ethic. Everybody was full of integrity. They were trustworthy. They were honest. Things that were really content of character concerns or issues. And if you look at society basically since the early 90s, really what we've shifted to is a personality ethic. So we're really terribly concerned about how people perceive us. So we have to look a certain way, or we have to drive a certain car. We have to live in a certain house in a certain part of the neighborhood. We have to make a certain amount of money. We have to go to the appropriate restaurants. We have to fly business or first class inside airplanes. So, and it's not that those things are bad, but it doesn't really lead to long-term and meaningful relationships. And it kind of shifts people away from focusing on the things that they have or the experiences that they have. And it shifts towards those, but away from the things that they actually care about, which is their personal mission. And that's what I care about more, is the personal mission. So I heard this on one of Gary Vaynerchuk's podcasts, and so it's a very, very interesting comment. And some younger guy had approached Gary and said, "Hey, like, I'm really kind of struggling. I'm struggling to overcome my fears, all these things. I don't really know what to do." And so Gary's suggestion to this young man was, go to a retirement home and volunteer there for a while, because what you're going to see repeatedly or hear repeatedly is essentially regret. That many of these folks, as they're towards the end of their life, they didn't do the things that they had truly desired to do, so they're now filled with regret. They didn't take risks or try specific things. So that made me think of another Harvard article that I had read a couple years back by a guy named Daniel Galati. And what Daniel had found was that as he was interviewing CEOs that were retiring, they basically regretted that they wished they wouldn't have worked for money, they wish they would have spent more time with their family, and 3, they wish they would have become entrepreneurs. And so I think Gary is basically saying the same thing, is that if you look at people who are at the latter stages of their life, oftentimes they're filled with regret because they did things that were disconnected from their why or their purpose. So a quick example, Joe, serial entrepreneur that I know, was having lots of success in the last probably, let's say, 15, 16 years as a serial entrepreneur, starting various businesses and just building them up. More recently, as society came out of kind of disfavor with one of his businesses, his income has fallen a little bit. So he's in the process of selling the business, and the stress associated with selling the business and income adjustments has caused difficulties in his marriage and, of course, with his children. So he has gone through some body changes where through stress eating or whatever, there's just been a weight gain, and he's not terribly happy with his body as it stands. But now what he's doing is he's starting up another business that's a little bit more built upon his body and his change and the things that he's doing to get in shape and trying to get other people engaged and encouraged to do the same thing. And I think that's an absolute perfect thing for him to do because of the Q&A process that he and I went through a couple months back, and really looked at the challenges that he had experienced in his life, and that by building up this business and sharing his journey so freely, he is absolutely going to be the person that he needed when he was younger. And I know that he's going to turn this into a multi-million-dollar business that's going to serve the community, but also his family incredibly well. So one of the things that I do when I help an individual write the mission is I really, really want them to have something that reminds them of that mission each day. And so, like I said earlier, right, it's very, very fulfilling to help others who are going through the challenges that that person's already overcome. So really, really fulfilling to have that happen. So what I'm really looking for is that thing that they can carry with them, that they can look at daily, that just reminds them of the mission. And maybe it's, for some people, it's going to canva.com and creating an image or a graphic for the background on their phone. Sometimes it's a physical thing that they can carry in their pocket. My dad, for a number of years, his mission was really around his family's business, or my family's business. And so he has a picture of his mom and his dad, inside of his wallet, which is a great physical trigger. Sometimes I've had other clients that really wanted to wear specific jewelry because they would travel around the world and, buy jewelry in specific countries. And every time that they looked at the piece of jewelry, or the piece of jewelry made noise, it reminded them of a great experience that they had in that country. I've worked with other clients that we've created pieces of art based on the mission. And another thing a friend sent me not too long ago along these lines is that if you're struggling to define your why or to surround yourself with the appropriate people, a really basic action that you can take, and my friend George, said this kind of funnily, but I did appreciate it. He's like, hey man, just drop from your life one loser friend and add one winner friend. And it's a very, very simple action to take if you're really committed to yourself and your goals. But to think about one person in your life that's not really helping you so much or doesn't believe in you very much, and then adding one person to your life that does truly believe in you and wants you to achieve, that could have huge ramifications in how you go through the achievement of your goals and accomplishing things. So just really, really quick wrap up here as we end up episode 8 of the podcast. So habit number 1, daily, does the person have the capacity to confront their fears, to find that middle and balanced ground? Under the pattern recognition and reflection, the habit is time distribution. Are they making the appropriate time for reflection and strategy and adjustment in the following 30 days? Habit number 3 is about that physical, mental, and spiritual health. Are they doing what they can to support their DNA and genetics and their epigenetics? Changing their diet, hitting the gym, meditating, praying, whatever that is for them. What can they do on a daily basis to make that happen? That 4th habit is the accountability partners. Are they really staying committed to specific goals by making their goals transparent and available to others? And the 5th one, are they living their why? This is really about, finding a way to drop that loser friend and gain that winner friend, because every single day, if we're using those physical triggers I just talked about as a way to move things forward and stay committed and be constantly reminded, we're going to be in tremendous, tremendous shape. So obviously it covered a lot of ground in this podcast, right? Went through an opening reflection that just helped us to kind of look at what are those processes that we use to set corporate goals, and how can we emulate that same process in the accomplishment of our personal goals. We looked at a few societal changes. Is there going to be a whole bunch of M&A activity? Is the stock market going to lose 20% of its value? Is the American Mall going to become the town square? Potentially. Looking at those 5 habits we just kind of talked about, and then really thinking about how do we do something with this, on a day-to-day basis. So if you can find a way to move from awareness to action by confronting fears, distributing your time differently, figuring out a way to care for your health, find an accountability partner, and then find that physical trigger that allows for you to stay focused in on your why every day, that is going to make a tremendous, tremendous difference. So I, in this podcast, talked about a ton of stuff, but I got to share my thoughts on 5 things that you can do daily this year in 2018, or habits you can use in 2018 to revolutionize what 2018 becomes to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Equal Chance to Be Unequal. I'm Michael S. Seaver. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on iTunes and like, share, or comment on this podcast on michaelseaver.com, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, or YouTube. Go forth and be awesome.